the way the human brain functions and the way artificial intelligence work are really completely different. But at the same time, there are now efforts to try to emulate some of the functioning of the brain in the next generations of AI. We'll see what happens to that. So in a way, the sequence of the two mornings works very well. And I would add that I mentioned on the first day that this was an emerging issue that was not as much in the news as artificial intelligence and data. But I was opening the Financial Times this morning, and there was an article just on the topics that we are going to discuss today. So it's an emerging, but already emerged in some way issue, and I'm very happy for that to partner with Jared Genser, who is over there, who has really, been instrumental in organizing this morning. And I will now give him the floor to run the show and to explain. We'll proceed a bit like we did yesterday, because this is a kind of issue that if you don't have the fundamentals, you get lost. And so we will start with the fundamentals and then move on to discussions. Over to you, Jared, who came especially from Washington. He has human rights. He runs a human rights law firm in Washington, and he got up at ungodly hours this morning to be with us.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you. I was up at 3:45 a.m. to catch the 4:50 train. I think it's the first time I've ever spoken where I got an applause for my means of transport, but I appreciate that. So, okay, yeah, great. Sure, yeah, and then it's okay, great. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So, first, by way of a little background on myself, I'm an international human rights lawyer based in Washington. I do lots of different things. You'll learn a little bit more about some of them here when we put up our bios. But I got involved in the topic of neurotechnology and human rights about 5 years ago now. In fact, because of a professor here at Columbia University named Rafael Yuste, who is an MD PhD expert on neurotechnology and runs the neurotechnology lab. And I was introduced to him by a friend, and he had been thinking deeply for the prior 5 years before that, so about 10 years ago now, about an experiment that he did in his lab with neurotechnology that kept him up at night and scared him. And it's what I would kind of call his Oppenheimer moment. And just briefly, the experiment was with mice. And what he did was he taught a mouse to lick a sugar syrup when it saw on a little TV screen in front of it a set of black bars going from left to right across the screen. So you turn on the bars, it licks. You turn off the bars, it stops licking. A mouse obviously has a much smaller brain than a human. And in a mouse, you can actually isolate and look at individual neurons firing individually. And in the visual cortex of the mouse, that's about 500 neurons firing when it's looking at the black bars and it's licking the sugar syrup. And with an fMRI, you're able to see the firing, an fMRI scanner, you're able to see the firing of those neurons. And then with an implantable brain-computer interface in that spot in the visual cortex, you can actually play the mouse's neurons like a piano and replicate precisely the pattern of their firing. And when he did that, and the screen was off, the mouse licked the sugar syrup as if it had been seeing the black bars. And what he had done was implant a hallucination into the mouse's brain. And ultimately, what can be done in a mouse today will be able to be done in a chimpanzee tomorrow and eventually in a human, because mice brains are modeled exactly as human brains, just a much smaller and less complex version. So it was having heard that story that for myself, I decided to get involved in this field and kind of go all in. Rafa knew a whole lot about neurotechnology and very little about international human rights. And so we collectively started the Neuro Rights Foundation, a foundation that promotes innovation, protects human rights, and supports the ethical development of neurotechnologies. And in essence, this will be the topic that I'll talk about today. So let me kind of talk about the overall approach that we're going to take this morning. We're actually going to have two sessions. This section, which is called Accessing the Brain, is focused on providing you with an overview of what are emerging technologies and really everything you need to know that you can cover in about an hour and 15 minutes. The second session of the morning is on the geopolitics of neurotechnology, and we'll be talking about efforts to provide new governance frameworks to regulate neurotechnologies at the multilateral level, national level, subnational, and with industry as well. And so in this first session, I'm going to provide a very brief introduction. Unfortunately, my colleague Rafa is teaching right now, so he is not available to be here in person, but he has about actually a 27-minute video where he will summarize all of these different things. And then afterwards, and as you can see on the screen in the background there, because obviously talking to a live person who's an expert at neurotechnology is a lot better than talking to a human rights lawyer who has no science background at all. Dr. Pauzauskie will join us for further discussion and Q&A. And again, I'll talk about his bio in a moment. So, this is the three of us by way of a little bit of background, and I'll, come back to putting up those bios in a moment when we come back to the video and then the discussion. But this is a little bit about who we are and our backgrounds. And I just want to provide, before we get to the video by Rafa, a one-page slide to define some key terms, because the bottom line is that this, for most people, in my experience, is something that they don't know a lot about unless you have a particular science background. And it's actually quite straightforward and easy to understand once you get into it. Not obviously of how it all works, but being able to understand in general what are neurotechnologies and so forth. So first, let's talk about the definition of neurotechnologies. These are devices that seek to record or alter the activity of the brain and the wider nervous system. What are BCIs and BMIs? These are brain-computer interfaces or brain-machine interfaces, and they connect brains, brains to computers, machines, or other devices, and they can facilitate communication in actually both directions between the brain and the outside world, either by exporting neural data or altering brain activity. Neural data, which is what is gathered by neurotechnologies, is information that is generated by the measurement of the activities of a person's central or peripheral nervous system. And there are two methods of doing this. One are direct methods like an EEG scan device. These can be wearable devices. And then there are indirect methods, which in essence measure the activity of the brain, but by looking at some other output from the brain from which you can then understand what's actually happening in the brain itself. fMRI is an example of that. And there are lots of different ways in which neurotechnologies operate. You see a list of them there. And then lastly, it's important to understand that there are two kinds of neurotechnologies. There are invasive neurotechnologies and non-invasive neurotechnologies. And this is going to be critical as we turn to the governance section a little bit later. But let me just pause on that for one moment to explain the important difference from the perspective that you all might have as diplomats at the UN, multilateral organizations, or other governments. And invasive neurotechnologies are devices that are actually implanted in the brain through neurosurgery. All such devices in the US, for example, have to be licensed as medical devices by the Food and Drug Administration. There are similar licensing procedures, obviously, in countries around the world. You can't just put something in a person's brain without it having been found to be both safe and efficacious. And the data that comes out of an implantable brain-computer interface is neural data. And it's generally, all that data is generally protected, what comes from invasive devices, under national or subnational health data privacy laws, right? So implantable devices, invasive devices, we are not really that worried as a general question about that data and how it's being handled. There are some sub-concerns with invasive devices, which we can talk about a little bit later. But in general, there's a legal and regulatory framework already in place to ensure that these devices work, that they're safe and efficacious, and that the data itself that comes from them are protected. We'll talk in a moment, and Rafael will talk a lot about what you can decode from neurotechnologies, which obviously then will be a very, very important part of understanding what they are and how they operate and function. And then the wearable devices, in fact, have really started to proliferate. There are more than 30 wearable consumer products that are wearable neurotechnologies. That can be a hat, a helmet, a bracelet, and so forth. And there are lots of different things you can do with these wearable devices today. You can buy them on Amazon. Just to give you one example, there's a device from a company called Muse, which is a meditation device, and you wear the EEG scanning device for an hour, let's say, while you're meditating. And then you're able to look on an app on your phone, and the data, your neural data, will have been sent to the company to evaluate. And then you're going to learn over that 1 hour period, when were you actually in a meditative state, right? And then over time, that could help you become better at meditating and maintaining that meditative state. But the problem is, as again, we'll talk about a lot more, that in neural data today, like a 1 hour scan, for example, from an EEG scanning device downloads somewhere between gigabytes to terabytes of data, of which today we can only decode about 1 or 2% of it. And from an existing EEG scan, a wearable device, you can determine if a person has about a half dozen different brain diseases and a dozen different mental states. Are you happy? Or are you sad? And so forth. Eventually, and we're talking only a few years from now, and then we'll turn to Rafa's video. We are also on the verge of a real revolution in our species, because we will be able to do thought to text translation, thought in the form of words. And the last thing I'll just say about that before we turn to Rafa's video is that to kind of get you a little bit more excited for what he'll have to say, is that there was a front page story in the New York Times 2 years ago about the work of Dr. Eddie Chang out at the University of California, San Francisco. He had been working with a woman who was paralyzed and nonverbal, locked in syndrome, as they call it. She had had a stroke 20 years earlier and had been literally totally paralyzed, but her brain continued to function as it did before the stroke, but she literally couldn't communicate in any way to her family or move in any way as well. And the story in the New York Times was about a study he did with her, that with an implantable brain-computer interface, an invasive device in her brain, she can now communicate at 80 words a minute with 95% accuracy with thought-to-text translation. And not only that, but Dr. Chang created an avatar of her for a screen, and even though her face can't move, you can actually decode the intended facial muscle movements. And so now her family can communicate with her very rapidly, and they can see her face light up as it did on the avatar, as it did when she before she had the stroke. And this is obviously an extraordinary breakthrough, but it raises enormous, as you can begin to imagine, human rights and ethical questions. And these devices are already being developed in a wearable form. The best known studies that are underway are in Australia and with an Australian university. And with a wearable EEG scanning device of the kind that I just mentioned, today with Gen AI powered software, you can decode thought to text translation at about 20 words a minute with about 50% accuracy right now. So definitely not ready for the market, but something that will be coming quickly, probably 3 years or so. And to give you a sense of why it's, I mean, it is an axiom of neurotechnology and of science in general that, what can be done in a invasive device today will eventually be able to be done in a wearable device. It's just a question of advancing the technologies. And Apple has already seen the future coming. And so they've actually already filed a patent application for their next generation AirPod, their earbuds that will have built-in EEG scanners in them. And they're envisioning a future already where in, let's say, 3 or 4 years, you may well be able to send, for example, a text message to a family member using your thoughts wearing the AirPods. They sell 100 million AirPods a year, Apple does. And so you can imagine the implications for governance of this kind of data, and how we need to start working now to get everything in place so that we're in a position to be able to ultimately get to a place where we can use these devices and feel some level of confidence that the data can be protected. So let me stop there for now as opening remarks. We're going to come back to Sean in just a little bit. But now we're going to watch this video from my colleague, Rafa.
Hello, my name is Rafael Yuste. I'm a professor of neuroscience at Columbia University in New York, and I'm also the director of the Neurotechnology Center at Columbia. So I'm talking to you from my office at Columbia, and you have my old microscope over here. And right behind me, there is a building which is a national monument. And this building is called Pupin Hall. And the reason it's a national monument is because in the basement of this building, in the 1940s, they built the first atomic reactor in the world. And the group of physicists who built this reactor built the atomic bomb. This was the Manhattan Project, and it was called Manhattan because it started right here in Manhattan, although they later took it to the desert in Los Alamos in New Mexico. And what I'd like to mention to you is that the same physicists that created the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, were the first ones to argue for international regulation of atomic energy. Thanks to their advocacy, the United Nations created the Atomic Energy Commission in Vienna, which has regulated the use of atomic energy for peace and warfare since then, without crossing fingers, without any mistakes. And this illustrates the point of my lecture, which is that science is neutral. Technology is neutral. You can build things to do good or bad. There's no use that is actually intrinsic with it. No? And it's this responsibility of the scientists and technologists who build these methods to ensure that their inventions are used for the good of mankind. So I'm going to be talking to you about another atomic energy moment which is coming our way, and that has to do with neurotechnology. Let me first define what is neurotechnology. So neurotechnology are methods that could be optical or electrical or based on nanophysics or chemical or acoustical or magnetic, to do two things. These devices can do two things. They can either record the activity of neurons in the brain, or they can change the activity of neurons in the brain. So why is neurotechnology important? Why should we care about neurotechnology? Well, it turns out that the brain is not just another organ. It happens to be the organ that generates all of the mental and cognitive abilities of humans. I'm talking about everything that we are: our thoughts, our memories, our imaginations, our emotions, our behaviors, even our subconscious. All of that doesn't come out of thin air, but it's generated by the activity of these vast networks of neurons that we have inside our skull, or also in the spinal cord. And this is what we call the central nervous system, or the peripheral nervous system. And we have about 100 billion neurons inside our skull. No? And this is an astronomical number of neurons, and they're connected through also a very large astronomical numbers of connections, to the point that every one of our brains probably has 3 times more nodes, connections, than the entire internet of the earth. No? So out of these internets, 3 internets that we have inside our skull, which, by the way, consumes almost no energy, it's powered by the equivalent of about a 20-watt bulb. No? Out of that comes all these mental and cognitive abilities. No? So because of that, neurotechnology is critically important for 3 reasons. One, because using neurotechnology, we'll be able to go in as scientists and decipher how the activity of these neurons generate our mental activity, how it generates our minds. And by doing that, we'll understand ourselves for the first time scientifically. This is going to be a turning point in history, like a new renaissance, where we'll finally understand what does it mean to be human, what is a human being. The second reason why neurotechnology is very important has to do with the clinic. As you know from personal experience with family members or friends, brain diseases have essentially no cure. I'm talking about diseases like schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, Parkinson, dementia, depression, mental handicap, paralysis, you name it. With very few exceptions, all these diseases are actually untouched by modern medicine. In spite of the heroic efforts of psychiatrists and neurologists, the only thing we can do with these patients is palliative care. No? And the reason is because we don't understand how the organ works. So we cannot really fix the machine if we don't understand how it works. So neurotechnology could be critical to enable clinicians to go into these brains of diseased humans or patients, figure out what's wrong and fix them in a targeted fashion. And the third reason why neurotechnology is important has to do with the economy. As I told you, we have like 3 internets up here, and they can compute all kinds of problems that even the best computers cannot solve. In spite of the great advances of AI, we have natural AI going up here. No? So it's very likely that evolution has found algorithms and ways to compute which are much more powerful than the ones that we have implemented in digital computers. So if we can understand these algorithms with neurotechnology, we'll be able to actually revolutionize modern technology and AI, based on natural algorithms as opposed to artificial algorithms. So so this tells you, we've discussed what is neurotechnology, why is it important. So let me ask, why now? Why should we worry now about neurotechnology and now in the past or in the future? Well, this has to do with President Obama, who in 2013 launched the US Brain Initiative, which is a large-scale project which today funds about 550 laboratories in the US and around the world, with a budget of approximately $1 billion a year. And this is a project that's supposed to last 12 years. And the purpose of this project is to develop neurotechnology. And President Obama launched it because of these 3 reasons: scientifically, medically, and economically. In fact, the key argument he made in his State of the Union address in February 2013 was the economic one. He convinced Congress that this investment in novel technologies, in neurotechnology, in these devices, could actually open up a new avenue of benefit for the economy in the future, just like it happened with the Human Genome Project. So it turns out that the US is not alone. The US Brain Initiative has inspired similar initiatives throughout the world, including Japan, including China, Australia, South Korea, Israel, Canada, and the European Union. And all of these brain initiatives were harnessed together in a declaration in 2017 when we formed the International Brain Initiative. So just like it happened with the Human Genome Project, in which different countries had their own Human Genome Project and they all came together in an international project, the same thing has happened with these brain initiatives. So each country is developing neurotechnology for all these reasons, and they're now all united in this International Brain Initiative. So this is fantastic news. And on top of these investments coming from governments, there's also very significant investments coming from the private industry. In the last year, we estimated that in the US, the tech companies were investing 3 times more funding in the development of new technology than the US Brain Initiative. So now we're talking about the private and public partnership in terms of developing these methods, which are going to be revolutionary. They're going to generate a new renaissance for our species. They help us with these brain diseases and also generate a bonanza for the economy. So this is all wonderful, and people like myself, we've worked on this our whole lives, are ecstatic that the world finally has understood the importance of new technology. But there's also issues with new technology that just like our colleagues in the atomic energy era, we have to alert society. These technologies are neutral. So this ability to go into the brain and record brain activity and the ability to change brain activity, by definition, since the brain generates the mind, will allow to record mental activity and to change or manipulate mental activity. So this is implicit. It goes hand with this technology. The great power can be used for medicine, for the economy, for science, or it can be used to essentially extract mental activity from people and alter that. No? How close are we to these scenarios? Well, as you mentioned, there's two types of neurotechnology. There is invasive neurotechnology that requires neurosurgery, okay, and this is very powerful, where you put these devices inside the brain. And there's non-invasive neurotechnology, which you can wear like a helmet, no, as if we're like a hat, a helmet, glasses, a diadem, or a bracelet. And that's less powerful because it doesn't directly contact the brain. Let me just give you a few examples of what we can do today with invasive and non-invasive neurotechnology. So invasive neurotechnology is very powerful, and with invasive neurotechnology in human patients that are, for instance, paralyzed and they cannot talk, some colleagues of us have used intracranial neurotechnology to decode speech and enable people to essentially synthesize speeches based on their thinking. No? And this is revolutionary for patients that have like a lock-in syndrome. You can actually connect them to the outside world. Also with neural stimulators, like deep brain stimulators, doctors now, thousands of patients around the world, tens of thousands really of patients around the world, use deep brain stimulation to alleviate symptoms related to Parkinson and to severe depression, and even for addiction in some cases. No? So I told you, we don't understand the brain to be able to cure these diseases, but at least we can make their symptoms less dire. No? So these are examples of the power of intracranial invasive neurotechnology. So you can record and decode speech, and you can change motor patterns, and you can change sometimes even behaviors based on it. Well, how about non-invasive ones? No? Because invasive neurotechnology, whether you want it or not, you have to go through a surgeon. So the entire ethics of medicine applies to it, no? And all the regulations of medical products. So the patient is protected because it's invasive neurotechnology is part of medicine. But non-invasive neurotechnology is not part of medicine. In fact, you can buy it as a consumer electronic product. You can order it in Amazon. No? So these helmets and these devices that are being sold right now, they're not very powerful because, again, but this is improving as the Brain Initiative in the US and other countries is enhancing the development of this neurotechnology. Then you could imagine that these devices are going to get better and better. But let me tell you what you can do today with this non-invasive neurotechnology. So there was actually a recent report from a group in Facebook that used EEG and MEG. So these are like helmet-based neurotechnology to decode speech. So this is a breakthrough. I think this is fantastic. I have people that I know that are paralyzed, and if they could wear one of these helmets, they could actually talk to their family members. No? But again, this alerts at the possibility of using these types of EEG recordings and decode them with artificial intelligence with deep neural networks to extract information about people's thought processes. If you can decode speech, well, maybe you can decode thoughts. Many people think by mentally talking. And also this year, in terms of stimulating neurotechnology, a group in the US reported the use of magnetic stimulation to enhance memory. So these are devices that you put next to your brain, but you don't need a surgeon. You can just buy them and do it yourself. And they report that particular regimes of stimulation can enhance particular types of memories. So this is the beginning of what could become mental augmentation, where you could use neurotechnology to enhance your cognitive abilities. No? This could happen through what we call a brain-computer interface, okay, that essentially connects the brain to the outside. It could be to a computer, it could be to a artificial intelligence system, it could be to robotic arms, to an avatar. No? So sooner or later, and this is unavoidable, because humans have always tried to augment ourselves since we invented the fire and the wheel. No? We're defined by this progress and the ability to do things better with every generation. So sooner or later, we're going to see the use of neurotechnology to enhance memory, to connect ourselves to external memory banks, for example, to increase our cognitive processing using artificial intelligence algorithms. So all these things will happen. I don't know when, but I can guarantee you that it will happen, no? Because again, we will have the ability to do that, and this will lead humans to try to improve themselves. Just like we invented the airplane to get from one place to another place very quickly. Well, this will be like mental flying. No? We'll use neurotechnology to mentally fly. No? So these things are happening. This is not science fiction. I mean, this report from Facebook decoding speech and these increases in memory using neurotechnology have been published this year. So because of that, a group of us got together in 2017 here at Columbia, and we call ourselves the Morningside Group because we met here in the Morningside campus of Columbia University. And this is a group of 25 experts that represented the brain initiatives from all these countries that I mentioned. Expert coming from neurotechnology, from the clinic, experts in the law, and in human rights. And we looked at this issue, at the ethical and societal issues of neurotechnology, and we came to the conclusion that this is a human rights issue. Because again, the brain is not just another organ, it's the organ that generates the mind, and we define ourselves as human because of our mental abilities. So if this is not a human rights issue, what is a human rights issue? This is a technology that goes to the core of what it means to be human. And we propose the idea of new human rights, which we call neuro rights, to protect brain activity from unwanted use, for negative uses of neurotechnology. So specifically, we argue for the right to our own mental privacy, so that the content of our mental activity cannot be decoded with our consent. The right to our own agency, to our own free will, so that decisions are made by humans without interfering with neurotechnology into their brain processes. The right to our own identity. So I told you that we use already in the clinic deep brain stimulation for instance, for Parkinson's patients. And some of these patients report that whenever you stimulate their brain, their personality changes. No? And this is not surprising because the brain generates a personality, generates who you are, your consciousness, your identity. So if you interfere with the brain, you're going to interfere with that too. And we think that this should be a basic human right. In fact, this should be the first human right, the right to your own identity, because if you don't have the right to your own identity, why do you need the rest of the human rights for now? We also thought that's important to promote the right of equal access to augmentation technology. So as I told you, mental augmentation and cognitive augmentation will happen. It's not going to happen today, but it will happen in the future. I don't know when. And it's very important that before that happens, we set out the rules as to how this technology to augment the human capabilities will be ushered. And we think it should be ushered in society under the universal principle of justice. So we were promoting the fair access to neural augmentation. And the final neural right is the right to protection from bias and discrimination in the algorithms that are used in neurotechnology. So neurotechnology and AI go hand in hand. All of this neurotechnology that I'm discussing today has an AI component. AI is necessary to decode brain signals and to also interfere with brain signals. And the minute that you use AI algorithms in the brain, you have the potential for introducing biases that could come with this algorithm directly into the brain of a person. And we think this is much worse than the usual biases that we see with social networks or digital media, because in this case, you're putting the bias directly inside the mind of the person. And we think this should be a basic human right, protection from biases. So with this agenda of neuro rights, we set out, created a foundation, the Neuro Rights Foundation, and you can find it in the web. Just type in Neuro Rights Foundation and you'll find us. And in the last few years, we are embarking in a series of initiatives related to neuro rights, to human rights protection against ill-intended uses of neurotechnology. And these have to do with research, in investigating these issues academically, scientifically. Also advocacy, discussing these issues with people in the world that can make things happen, that can change things, either governments, international organizations, and also outreach, providing this message and this information to society as a whole, and just like I'm doing today with you. So the Neuro Rights Foundation, we've been around for just a few years, but we've already had some initiatives with particular countries. So let me just highlight what's happening in Chile. The Republic of Chile has changed its constitution with a constitutional amendment to Article 19 of the Constitution that protects brain activity and the information that comes from it as a basic human right. So there's one country in the world, in Chile, where if you're a Chilean citizen, your brain activity and its information is protected by the Constitution. And this is thanks to the work of the Chilean Senate, and we collaborated and helped them providing expertise and our work for this constitutional amendment. We're also working with other countries, with Spain, for example, where the Charter of Digital Rights has been announced by the government of Spain, and this Charter of Digital Rights, which is a soft law, it's a series of guidelines for future laws, incorporate neuro rights in one of their chapters now. And we're also working with the United Nations, both in the New York headquarters with the Office of the Secretary General, and also in Geneva with the Human Rights Council, to explore these issues, particularly with respect of mental privacy, which is maybe the issue that's most urgent, I would think, and to see how we could fit these types of neuro rights protection within the existing system of human rights in the UN. The UN has a Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also has a series of global treaties that are signed by most countries in the world. And there's many different types of human rights treaties, and even though they don't cover these neuro rights, according to our study, they're not sufficient, but maybe they can be fixed, or you could introduce a special opinion to provide some type of neuro rights protection within the existing treaties. And with this, I wanted to finish with a final comment, actually a couple of comments. One is that neurotechnology is actually good. I'm very positive about neurotechnology. I'm bullish in spite of these potential problems. This is the way to go. Again, for scientific reasons, for medical reasons, just to help these patients, we have to urgently develop neurotechnology, and also for economic reasons. But and I honestly think we're going to be entering a new renaissance, because once we understand the brain, we understand ourselves for the first time now. So in spite of these warnings, again, I think I don't want to scare you. I think that neurotechnology is something that you should embrace, and your country should embrace, because it will move humanity forward towards a better future, a better humanity. And the final comment is that this human rights approach to the regulation of technology, which in the case of neurotechnology, we think it's obvious. Again, if this is not a human rights issue, interfering with your brain activity, what is a human rights issue? But the same recipe could be used to other technologies, and I'm thinking here of technologies such as AI, surveillance technologies, robotics, social networks, the metaverse, even genetic engineering. Governments have tried to regulate these technologies with specific laws and guidelines, and they mostly have failed. In case of the digital technologies, AI is one example. Relying on the industry's self-regulation just doesn't work. It's not in the purpose, in the bones of the industry to self-regulate. But maybe providing a human rights approach could be a good solution, not just for neurotechnology, but for all these other technologies, because it's a global framework, and that would help equilibrate, again, the situation across all countries. No? And it's also hard law, it's not soft law. I mean, human rights treaties have real consequences, have sanctions, and can end up with people in jail if they break the human rights. No? So we think it's actually it is an appropriate answer to these challenges of the world that we're living in with all these disruptive technologies. And in a way, a human rights framework defines what type of human being we want to be. So this is my proposal to you. Let's think about the future. Let's define what type of human being we want to be. Let's codify this in the human rights, and then let's develop whatever technology we want as long as it fits this idea of what type of humans that we want to be. Thank you.
Sean is a rock star practitioner, neurologist, and researcher at University of Colorado Health out in Denver. He's also medical director of our foundation. And importantly, because this is much broader than just simply being a neurologist, he's the incoming president of the Colorado Medical Society, which is the statewide association of all physicians that advocates for science and medicine in the state of Colorado. And he, as a practicing neurologist, as we'll discuss in a moment, also actually uses neurotechnology devices in his practice as a neurologist, and we'll get into that shortly. And we can, I guess, turn this off so we can see Sean in a
Let me try.
larger than life sense.
No promises.
Oh, Sean, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
You're now easily, just your head alone is about 4 or 5 from top to bottom. Everybody can see you very, very well. So I'm just going to start with a couple questions for Sean, and then we'll open it up and most of the rest of the time Q&A. We have about a half hour. But Sean, let me going up to what I say, I'd love to hear your views as a practicing neurologist. So Rafa is a scientist and researcher. He is not a practitioner. One of the most important things about emerging technologies are how are they going to impact the practice of medicine and practice. Lots of other people be excited about it too, but for a moment, let's start there. So Sean, based on your experience and having heard about it as well, for you, what is the most exciting thing about emerging neurotechnology? What is it, as a person who sees patients every day, what are you most excited about when you see all the studies coming out about expanded uses of neurotechnology?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question, Jared, and thanks everyone for being here. So, as Dr. Yuste elucidated so well, this really is going to be a revolution on many levels. And in the clinic, I would say that that revolution I find just so exciting, given that when I started out as a practicing neurologist, I really thought that the coming revolution was going to be in pharmaceuticals, and that we were going to have dozens of new drugs to treat diseases. But in fact, it's actually turned out to be that these devices are going to be the revolution in how we treat patients with neurological conditions. So I've actually brought a few of these devices to show you today. One of these we alluded to is a simple headband. You can see that these sensors here are made of silver. They can be put on just like any other headband. They also have near infrared light. These sensors here can actually detect blood flow in the brain. So going deep into the brain to figure out the functioning of different circuits. We have devices like this, these EEG earbuds from a company called Emotive that you can just put on your ears and start collecting brain waves and detect all sorts of things about different mental and emotional states. As Dr. Yuste mentioned, neurotechnology is both reading, such as this device, and then also influencing brain activity. And so a headband like this is actually designed to not only record brain activity, but to introduce sound waves into the brain with marked indications for things like sleep. And so in just one final example here, a pair of earmuffs that have EEG. These are silver sensors in the earmuffs that you can actually just put on and just wear on an everyday basis. So I just wanted to show a few examples before launching into just to kind of give you a sense of what these tools look like. So I'll just give one example. So a patient that I had last year came into the hospital after having a heart attack. And loss of blood flow to the brain definitely influences things like sleep and cognition, and all sorts of different dimensions about how the brain functions. And so 10 years ago, for that type of patient, I might have told them try to do these things, sleep better, maybe exercise, eat a healthier diet, and but basically, or maybe a pharmaceutical intervention. Those were still in the early development. But as you can see today, very clearly, very tangibly, now I have tools. For example, this sleep headband to tell the patient, try this, and it might alleviate some of your symptoms of your cognitive disorders, or as Jared mentioned earlier, things like meditation have been well validated to reduce stress levels and improve cognition. And so really the revolution in the clinic are the tools that I'm now able to provide to patients and give them different options. I will mention that it is still in the early phases of the development of some of the clinical applications of these technologies. And so the language and how we talk about these things is important. So, things that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, will always be the gold standard. But you can see this coming revolution of technologies that I can talk about and tell patients that try this headband or try this device, and it might alleviate some of your symptoms of depression, or it might alleviate some of your symptoms of insomnia, and things of that nature. So not FDA approved, but still tools that are really allowing us to treat patients in a more data-driven, more tangible way, and seeing some good results. And so I'm very excited and like Dr. Yuste, very bullish on these new tools to help treat patients.
Thanks a lot, Sean. What's your biggest fear about these emerging technologies?
That's a very good question, and kind of cuts straight to the heart of what we're talking about today. So my biggest fear is that some of these devices, they're not under the umbrella of current protections under federal health privacy laws. And so the data that these devices are collecting are actually being sent to private companies into databases that could then be used to decode all sorts of, the brain diseases that I would be trying to treat. And so that was kind of my entry point into this, was that concern that while we have these tools and these methods, that they aren't currently under the same umbrella of federal health information protections.
And can you give us a sense? I talked a little bit about this in my introduction. Rafa talked a little bit about it as well. But what do you think is going to be possible with these wearable devices in, let's say, 10 years? What kind of information do you think will be able to be decoded, and what kind of alteration might be able to be done to brain activity if you're thinking out at a 10-year time frame? To be fair, I know you're not in the lab on a daily basis doing intense research, although you do a lot of research as well. But it'd be great to kind of for the audience here, for them to hear a little bit more about what's coming. And as of course Rafa mentioned, these are all dual use technologies, right? They can be used for good or for bad. But would love to hear your thoughts about what do things look like in a decade?
Yeah. So I think that in a decade's time, these technologies will be used for a vast spectrum of both cognitive, mental, and neurological disorders. Patients will have options to really train their brains. I see as one of the big emerging uses of these non-invasive neurotechnologies. There's something that we call broadly EEG neurofeedback, which is in which some of these devices are employing today. So recording brain activity and then actually influencing it through the use of things like sound or sound waves from this sleep headband. So I think that in 10 years' time, a patient who is having, say, a difficulty quitting smoking, we'll just use one common example, might be able to use one of these consumer products to really train their brain in a very granular, data-driven way, so that when they're, for example, having a craving or something like this, a stimulus might be able to be introduced in a well-validated, clinical setting to help them, for example, quit smoking. And that's just one example. Things like treating depression, treating anxiety, treating all sorts of mental health disorders, having these data-driven tools as you mentioned earlier, Jared, to track meditation and enhance meditation, reduce stress levels, alleviate symptoms of depression and anxiety. I think this will be a common, kind of alternative really to pharmaceutical intervention, and very exciting because, as we all know, pharmaceuticals all have side effects. And so these are things that, I view as a very, clean and safe way of alleviating those types of mental health and cognitive disorders.
Let me ask you about mental augmentation or neural mental augmentation specifically, because mental augmentation can come in many different forms, including pharmaceuticals. Just to build on what Rafa was saying earlier about enhancing of memory and to be very tangible for all of you in the audience, there's a study, he was referencing a study published at Boston University 2 years ago, using, working with senior citizens, older people in the lab, and with a neurostimulation device, which was electrical stimulation to the outside of the skull, underneath which short-term memory lies. In a peer-reviewed study, they were able to increase the short-term memory of senior citizens in their ability to memorize a list of 20 items by 40% for a period of 1 month. In other words, they can remember 8 more items because of this stimulation, which on a base of 20 is pretty extraordinary. So Sean, what kind of other mental stimulation or neural mental stimulation, augmentation do you see on the horizon? What kinds of things do you think we might be able to enhance about ourselves as humans in the coming years?
Yeah, so great question. So yeah, that study at Boston University was very exciting for the development of methods to really directly enhance memory through stimulation using magnetic pulses deep into the brain. I've also seen studies recently at the American Academy of Neurology. In one of our plenary sessions, we were talking about enhancing the ability of stroke patients to recover from a stroke. About 1 in 6 stroke patients has a difficulty speaking after their event, and it's actually stimulating the opposite side of the brain from the one that language is centered on. About 90% of people on the left side of the brain, but if you stimulate the right side of the brain with these magnetic pulses, seeing very good outcomes in terms of giving people the ability to speak again. So mental augmentation, just to kind of maybe give a broad overview of some of the modalities. So we're talking about magnetic pulses introduced into the brain. There's also electrical stimulation into the brain using things like low amplitude electrical currents. There are actually consumer devices today that are marketed to help you fall asleep, stay asleep longer using these electrical currents. We also have what's called focus ultrasound, which is a different method using sound pulses that go deep into the brain and can alleviate certain things like I've seen a great study about refractory depression and very targeted areas in the brain with these sound wave pulses into the brain. That's actually what this consumer headband was trying to do for sleep, is to introduce sound waves that actually kind of serve as a noise cancellation for brain waves, help you fall asleep faster. So these are all kind of under the broad umbrella of neural augmentation. We talked about neurofeedback, giving real-time stimulus to the brain recordings, and then as we go deeper into the getting beyond the skull and into the brain, those capabilities just become more and more readily available, and we might be seeing the ability to interact with technologies in a way that like Dr. Chang's study that could become more commonplace. So just see a very bright future and a lot of these very exciting things on the horizon.
I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, then turn it to the audience for the last 15 minutes. My next question is on the safety of these devices. You were just talking, for example, about wearable devices, and you'll forgive my layman's way of putting it, but zapping your brain with electricity. That sounds like it could be dangerous. And so what is your assessment of these wearable devices today that are using electrical or magnetic stimulation? And what kind of studies are being done of the use of these kinds of devices to look at short, medium, and long-term impacts beyond the intent of the device itself?
Yeah, so great question. I mean, that's actually, I think, kind of what's coming in the next, I would say, 1 to 2 years. I think it would be wonderful to do a deep dive into all of these technologies that are stimulating the brain and really get granular about the science behind them and sort of the safety profiles. We know certain things, for example, about low amplitude electrical stimulation into the brain. It can cause things like headaches. Everything has side effects. But over time, I think those are the things and why we need to be cautious in how these technologies are brought forth into the marketplace and really across the world, because just like with certain medications in the past, just use one analogy, we always do safety trials at the beginning, then look at efficacy as things go through our Food and Drug Administration approval process, and then you get the broad randomized controlled clinical trial before something is approved and marketed for, and licensed and patented and approved for widespread use. And so we're not quite there yet when it comes to these devices. We know certain things based on smaller studies, things coming out of the laboratory, or just based on kind of anecdotal evidence. But really, I think that these things are going to have to go through maybe a few growing pains when it comes to their validation methods. But I think that we will know more very soon. And there's no reason to believe now that there are going to be any, prohibitive hurdles that, for example, that study at the Boston laboratory, I would be surprised if that doesn't grow into a large multi-center trial where multiple patients are, enrolled, 1,000 patients or more to get the statistical significance. And then we'll be able to say with confidence that, this was the side effect profile. And then as long as really what this is getting at and really boils down to is this concept of informed consent. So you always want your patients to know what they're getting into. We always talk to patients very upfront about not only what the drug is going to do or what the treatment is going to do, but what can they expect in terms of the side effect profile. And I think that we will get there. We're not quite there yet, but once we are, I feel like that's only going to bolster and kind of buttress the industry. And we'll be able to say with much more confidence what people are getting into.
My last question for you relates to the consumer products that are on the market today. There are about 30 of them. You were mentioning a number of examples where, in your experience, some of these devices can actually be helpful based on your anecdotal experience with them. But as you know, with the consumer devices, they're not regulated in any way at all, basically, for safety, for efficacy, or for the protection of neural data. And this is something that the Neuroscience Foundation, obviously, that we're both a part of, are working on. But my question for you relates to this, the health-related devices that are wearable, which are all kind of under the general category of wellness. That's the kind of description that is used to describe these devices. And when you're in the wellness category rather than the, the medical device category, there is no requirement, for example, to do peer-reviewed studies to even show that your device works. And you can have questions of, obviously, potentially false advertising, misrepresentation, partial information being shared with people. So people aren't really giving informed consent, not only about what the device might do and the side effects, but how your data might be used for other purposes. But my last question is really around the question of assessing the viability and the efficacy of these consumer devices, especially in the wellness space. And what is your sense, based on having looked at, for example, the 30 devices that we identified through our foundation that are available on the market today? What is your sense as to whether the claims that they make about what they can achieve, how does that match with the actual reality of how the devices actually perform?
So that's another great question, and one that we definitely need to dive into, very deeply, both at the foundation and beyond, in terms of this idea of, false advertising. And so I would say that I think a lot of the reason behind that is that, things that are developed in a kind of, controlled laboratory setting and have some kind of, small sample size or some kind of, maybe anecdotal effect are then, kind of broadcast and kind of blown up into something that may or may not bear out, in the method. And so that's why I think that applying things like the medical model to these devices is wise. And I think that the companies would agree that, nobody should be out there, promising, the snake oil of neurotechnology that, this device is going to cure your depression, or it's going to cure your insomnia, or it's going to, treat a disorder. We can't say that right now under this wellness umbrella. But as time goes on, I think that, time and, as we all know, data is always our friend. And the more data that we have, the more assured that we'll be. And so all I can say today is that I see promise for these devices, and remain cautiously optimistic. I'm not going to get out there and say things about their efficacy that, is not validated by the process, by the, the FDA process of approval. So I feel like it's kind of like we're at that kind of somewhat liminal space for these devices, and that I have seen, certain good outcomes with certain patients who, have tried them. But again, it boils down to the language and how we talk about these things. And so we're not saying that these devices are going to treat any disorder. It's just that they might alleviate certain symptoms. And I think as long as we stick to that type of language and stick to that, kind of concept, then that peril and that informed consent, I feel better about kind of how these devices are going to be brought forward into the clinic. And to Dr. Yuste's point about the medical advances, I still think that we're going to get there eventually, but we have to go through the process.
Thanks so much, Sean. So let's open it up to the audience. If you can give us your name and what organization you're affiliated with, your government or the UN or so forth.
Thank you. Thank you, George Commander, Permanent Mission of Sierra Leone to the UN, 6th Committee expert. I came in a bit late, maybe not, I didn't miss that much, hopefully, but the first speaker talked quite a lot about creating basic human rights, and you also recently in your conversation, you mentioned informed consent. So my question really is just to try to maybe go deeper into that in terms of doing this process of securing the informed consent. There have been talk on the ethics of using this new development and this new technology, because it's important to talk about the ethics and also the equity of its use in that regard. So has there been that discussion? And I know you ended on a cautiously optimistic note, so hopefully I will get a cautiously optimistic answer for that. Thank you.
So let me take a first crack at it, Sean, if you want to add anything. I think that, again, there's a huge distinction between the invasive and the non-invasive devices. Invasive devices, licensed, medical products and data protected. Consumer devices, non-invasive, it's the Wild West, as we would say in the United States. No regulation at all. I think that, we are going to have to very, very quickly advance global regulatory framework through multilateral institutions and have that combined with national and subnational legal and regulatory frameworks as well. I think ultimately, we have a long way to go. Our next session that we'll have in about half an hour is going to be all about global governance, and we're going to hear from someone who has played a major role at the UN Human Rights Council and someone else who worked for the Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Committee talking about neurotech. So we're going to get into a lot of the regulatory questions going forward. But I will say that on the question of informed consent, in a medical context, it's quite clear. And the kind of way in which, I've been spoken to by a doctor when I had a minor surgery, for example, or you go in and have a procedure, we're very used to like medical informed consent where the doctor will sit down with you and talk you through it and answer questions, et cetera. But when it comes to the consumer devices, that model of informed consent doesn't work well at all, because the reality is that this data is dramatically more sensitive than any other kind of data you could give away. And most of us, including myself, who's a lawyer, if you get some kind of electronic device, it pairs to your phone, whatever the case might be, the waiver pops up on the screen and you like scroll to the bottom, don't read any of it and say, I agree. So that clearly is not going to be sufficient when you're talking about wearable neurotech devices. And it's something that we at the foundation are thinking about. I mean, obviously one way that the more sophisticated user agreements operate is that they require you to agree to like 5 or 6 very short specific statements and can't let you're not allowed to skip through it all, right? You have to actually go one step at a time. That's clearly one basic way to look at this, but these kinds of devices are going to be coming fast and furious. And, as one illustration, my colleague Rafael Yuste would tell you that, eventually we're going to be able to decode subconscious thought, not just conscious thought, right? And, when you're now handing over your neural data, which can be from gigabytes or terabytes of data in these wearable devices, and today only a certain amount of things can be done with that data, but years later, other things will be able to be decoded. How do you inform the person up front about the risks of that happening? And so we were talking about this device. I was talking about this device in Australia doing thought to text translation with Gen AI powered, EEG scanning devices. And the device in Australia does, although right now it requires being trained to the individual person, ultimately it will not require training. And it can decode a person's thought in the form of words without their consent. And what that ultimately means is that just the product I mentioned, the Muse device, which does meditation, they've on their website spoken about how they have 100 million hours of consumer neural data from people who have bought their devices and used them for meditation. And what that means is in 3, 4, 5 years, whenever this thought to text translation, Gen AI powered software can be applied to an EEG scan, that company would literally be able to go back into the 100 million hours and decode what you were thinking in the form of words while you had been meditating years earlier, right? And so if you're buying the meditation device today, how do you properly get informed about these possibilities? We'll talk again in the next session about the challenges of regulating emerging consumer neurotechnologies, but our foundation did a major study that was covered on the front page of the New York Times about consumer neurotech devices. And what we did is looked at all of the ones in the market you can buy today, and we evaluated the user agreements of those 30 devices and benchmarked them against a half dozen global privacy standards. My colleague Stephen, who's here, will talk more about that in the next panel. But what we found is literally only one of these devices is actually totally secure because it keeps the data locally and it never goes to the company. But in the other 29 cases, in many respects, for example, a third of the companies didn't even mention they're gathering your neural data at all, let alone like what could be done with it and so forth. So, and in most of these companies allowed the sale and transfer of your data. So when it comes back to the heart of your question, which is how are we going to be sure as consumers that this stuff gets used properly? How are we giving informed consent? It's a gigantic question and a really, really important one. And one of the things that's being discussed in a lot of multilateral and national context.
Good morning. Thank you for a fascinating panel. It's a bit like the Netflix show Black Mirror, but
it is actually, yeah.
Truth is stranger than fiction. But just maybe fully agree it's a human rights issue, a lot of ethical questions, and maybe it's really time for us at the UN to think about a kind of digital convention and neurotech convention on human rights. Maybe it's time. It's just the way forward. But I wanted to maybe just touch upon the question of equity that George also alluded to, coming from the global South, developing countries, deeply concerned that here is yet another tech divide. Professor Yuste mentioned the small group of countries talking together, but it's a very another selective grouping of countries. Where countries from the developing world will not only be using maybe this technology, so our data, our brains will be scanned and used by these companies, these countries. How can developing countries, like, if this will really reshape the way we think and the way we are, who we are, especially in this field, we need to come up with guardrails so that other countries can be involved, help shape this technology. And of course, I think this is more related to the regulatory and global governance questions later, but it's at the very start, I think we have to start talking about these things, and not like with AI, nuclear, other technologies, it comes much later. It's almost as if it's a less important question, but in fact, it's deeply, deeply relevant if we want to attain sustainable development for all countries and achieve, inclusive and everything we're fighting for a fair world, right? So I just wanted to ask you and Sean about how can developing countries access these technologies in a fair and a balanced way?
Yeah, I mean, to be blunt about it, we obviously want to avoid in the development and application of emerging neurotechnologies a digital colonization of countries around the world, where in essence, they're on the, countries around the world are on the receiving end, and your citizens are on the receiving end of buying these technologies, and then your data is being harvested to feed the profitability of a small number of very large tech companies. That is undoubtedly a front and center real risk that we face right now. There are a lot of discussions that we'll talk about in the next session going at the UN. As I was mentioning before, a member of actually the advisory committee to the UN Human Rights Council, who is the rapporteur in a major report on neurotech and human rights, will be on the next panel. And we'll be able to talk to you about what's happening in the UN human rights system about that. But I couldn't agree more with you that this is why these discussions have to be happening right now. And I think that there's a lot of thought being given to provide tools to countries that, for example, may not have indigenous neurotech experts or researchers, but yet will be on the receiving end of purchasing the technology either for governmental purposes or private actors, and ensuring that even if your country doesn't have experts on the technology, that there are lots of tools available, training, technical assistance, and support to ensure that at the very barest minimum, you're able to manage the impact of these emerging technologies on your own people. Obviously, we need to go dramatically beyond that, and really every country in the world has to be at the table to talk about where's the tech heading, what are the implications of it going to be. I agree with you fully that the risk of an enormous and broadened digital divide is a mammoth risk with these emerging technologies. So, my own view is, again, we'll talk about it in the next session, but obviously I couldn't agree more with the sentiment of your remarks.
I might just add that I feel like the medical community might have something to add to this in terms of outreach and, just making sure that, like with other medical outreach programs that we've seen, that countries who may not have the opportunity to have certain devices or have the opportunity to have certain treatments get those treatments because of the efforts of, physicians and the medical community.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I work for the UN, and thank you for the discussion. It's not intended as a joke. It's really mind-blowing to learn all of these things. And there are many questions, I think, for the next panel, but a very practical one that I think you kind of addressed in your first answer. When you're talking about these technologies or this possibility of translating thoughts into text, etc., when we do that in a, let's say, natural way, we of course we decide what goes there and we decide what to filter, etc. So if I understand correctly from the answers that you gave, there are some technologies and mechanisms that have that possibility or give us still the chance or the will, the power to decide what goes into that, but there are others that are being developed or will be developed that will kind of bypass our willpower in terms of deciding what gets out of our thoughts and what is shared with basically with the public or with whoever gets the information.
Sean, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so if I understand the question, so we're worried about things that could actually influence thought.
No, I think she was more saying, to what extent were these devices, are we going to be able to control what the devices receive versus they're just kind of passively sucking up all of our neural data. I was mentioning the device in Australia where you don't have to cooperate, but you can still decode thought to text. And will that be something that will be able to be prevented in emerging neurotech? Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely an issue that needs to be sorted out, and would definitely advocate for the complete control of what's shared with the device versus what's not shared with the device, which is one reason that we've advocated so strongly that consumers have the ability to control their neural data. And so that's one principle that we're advocating for very strongly. But I think that's going to boil down to kind of the practices of the companies. Once a device is on and turned on, there's very little that you can do to sort of filter the brain activity. It just sort of is what it is. But at the end of the day, I think that certain safeguards can be put in place through certain things that we're working on with various companies where consumers really have that control of the data. And so that's kind of, we'll get into that in just a little bit, but that principle I think should be a bedrock of these devices, is that users have complete control of the data that's being collected, and that certain things can and can't be done with that data based on things like the informed consent that we've been talking about.
The current technology today only allows for, let's say, an EEG scanning device for a full brain scan to be done, an EEG scan. right? And it's, as I said, from gigabytes to terabytes in size, depending on how long you wear the device. And that whole scan will, in all but one of the cases that I mentioned of the 30 companies, go to that company to then decode. And they only need usually less than 1% of that data to serve the narrow purpose of what that device does. My hope would be, and I don't know anything about the science and tech, maybe Sean does, I'm the human rights guy, but my hope would be eventually you're going to be able to get devices, scanning devices that can only draw out of your brain the information that actually is needed for the use of the device itself. Right now, that is not possible. And this is one of the big problems, of course, is what's in all of the other data that is being taken out. There's also, and again, we'll talk about it a little bit in the next session, you know, a principle in consumer data privacy laws that relates to what's called data minimization, right? And so, you know, for example, will best practices ultimately be for companies that if they're sucking out a full brain scan right now, that they should, you know, take out whatever data they need for their narrow purpose and everything else should be automatically deleted, right? And is that like a principle that could be pushed to be adopted by companies and so forth?
Yeah, I might just add one more thing. So I think I understand a little bit better. So there's actually this concept we've been exploring about something called homomorphic encryption, which is a way to collect data and then only have calculations be done on the data that's been collected after it's been encrypted. So that essentially it's a blind method of collecting data, and then the calculations would only be done on that data after it's collected. So kind of like a barrier against companies, you know, just doing anything. They would only have access to calculations on data after it's been encrypted. And I think that's called homomorphic encryption. So that's one potential kind of technical scientific solution.